Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial and unbelievable true crime stories in American history, where the line between brilliance and brutality is blurred beyond recognition. Imagine this: a man who once killed behind bars, robbed a bank, and spent decades in solitary confinement, suddenly hailed as a prison philosopher. A man thought to be beyond redemption is released from prison, not because he served his time, but because a world-renowned author believed his words proved he had changed. Just 6 weeks later, he stabbed a complete stranger to death. Over a petty argument about a bathroom. And just like that, every piece of praise, every hopeful article, every defense, crumbled. His name was Jack Henry Abbott. A name once splashed across the front pages as a symbol of the prison system's cruelty. But also a name that would later come to represent something far more chilling. What happens when evil wears the mask of intellect, and we fall for it? In today's video, we're not just telling a murder story. We're asking bigger questions. Should a killer be forgiven just because he writes beautifully? Can a book truly change a man's soul? And when trust is shattered by the very person we fought to free, who pays the price? Stay with us. Because the story of Jack Henry Abbott isn't just a true crime, it's a modern tragedy about trust, ego, and the darkness that can live within genius. Part 1, A Broken Childhood, How Society Built a Monster. Jack Henry Abbott wasn't born a killer. But he was never really given a chance to be anything else. Born in 1944 in Michigan, Abbott was the unwanted product of a troubled marriage, his father, an Irish-American soldier, and his mother, a half-Native American, half-Chinese sex worker with a history of drug abuse. From the very beginning, Abbott was thrown to the fringes of society, unloved, unwanted, and invisible. Tua lon len kong phi trong mot gia din, ma trong mot chui kak na jiam tre 6 ton niem. I didn't grow up in a family, I grew up in a string of juvenile detention centers. This is how Abbott later described his childhood in a letter to author Norman Mailer. At just 9 years old, Jack was sent to reform school for stealing. Not for greed, but out of hunger. Hunger for food. Hunger for love. Hunger for someone, anyone, who might care. Inside those juvenile institutions, he learned one thing above all. Violence is the only language that matters. Abbott's childhood became a conveyor belt of reformatories, beatings, and psychological torture. No one taught him love. No one showed him trust. He learned to survive by hitting first, before he could be hit. And when you grow up in a world where power belongs to the violent, taking a life starts to feel natural. In 1965, at age 21, Abbott was serving time in a Utah prison for forgery, a non-violent offense. But while inside, he stabbed another inmate to death. According to him, the man had tried to sexually assault him. Self-defense or not, someone died, and Jack Henry Abbott officially became a killer. From that point on, his life became inextricably tied to prison. Years later, he escaped and robbed a bank in Colorado. That earned him another 19 years in federal prison. Throughout his time behind bars, he developed a reputation as violent, erratic, and rebellious, often kept in solitary confinement for long stretches. I've lived so long in the belly of this beast, that I became the beast myself. Jack Henry Abbott, from a letter to Norman Mailer. What makes Jack Henry Abbott's case so complicated is this. People can't help but wonder, did we create him? Here was a boy born into poverty, abandonment, and systemic neglect. A child thrown into juvenile prisons instead of rehabilitation. A teenager taught only to fight or be destroyed. So when society locked him away in a world of violence, punishment, and isolation, did we really expect him to grow into a kind man? That's exactly the question that haunted many authors, intellectuals, and activists when they later read his prison letters. To them, Jack wasn't just a criminal, he was a victim of the system. A child society gave up on. A boy swallowed whole by the prison beast, and regurgitated as a monster. Jack Henry Abbott, the infamous killer, wasn't just a bad guy. He was a product of a brutal system, a rotten childhood, and a society that never gave him a path back to humanity. And the most ironic part? Out of that darkness, he started to write, and he wrote beautifully. Part 2, when a pen became the key to freedom. In the last section, we saw how Jack Henry Abbott, a child raised in darkness, twisted by abandonment and violence, became a product of a cruel prison system. But what happened next is something no one could have predicted. After spending decades behind bars, in solitary confinement, in silence, in a world with no love and no hope, Abbott began to write. Not for pleasure, but to survive. Writing became the only thread keeping him connected to sanity, and to the last shred of humanity left inside the monster that prison had created. In 1979, Abbott came across the name of Norman Mailer, a famous author and Pulitzer Prize winner, who was working on a novel about another infamous death row inmate, Gary Gilmore. Abbott wrote him a letter. To his surprise, Mailer responded. What followed was a 2-year exchange of letters between prisoner and writer. In those pages, Abbott revealed a brilliant, even poetic, mind. He dissected the prison system with chilling clarity, describing it as a machine designed not to reform, but to crush. He wrote about the horrors of solitary confinement, the dehumanization of inmates, and the slow, psychological death that prison brings. Out there, you're a person. In here, you're scum, not because of what you did, but because you're locked up. Jack Abbott, in a 1980 letter. Mailer wasn't just impressed, he was captivated. To him, Abbott wasn't just a criminal. He was a wrongfully buried genius. A philosopher trapped in a cage. So, Mailer did something that stunned the entire nation. He personally advocated for Jack Henry Abbott's early release, claiming that Abbott had reformed and deserved a second chance. To Mailer, Abbott wasn't a threat, he was a writer who could make a difference in the world. In 1981, just before Abbott was released, his letters to Mailer were compiled into a book titled In the Belly of the Beast. The book exploded onto the literary scene. Critics called it a masterpiece. A searing, intellectual indictment of the American prison system. Abbott was hailed as the voice of the voiceless, a man who had suffered immensely but emerged with profound insight. He became a celebrity author overnight, while still behind bars. But just weeks after his release, headlines shattered the illusion. Killer freed by Norman Mailer murders again. Here's what made this story so tragic. Abbott wasn't faking his writing talent. His words were truly powerful. But powerful writing doesn't equal moral transformation. Literature can elevate the soul, but it doesn't guarantee redemption. And sometimes, the most dangerous people are those who use words like masks to hide what they really are. Abbott didn't just fool Norman Mailer. He fooled an entire generation of readers, critics, journalists, and activists, people who wanted desperately to believe in rehabilitation, in miracles, in second chances. In a society worn down by war, inequality, and injustice, people were desperate for stories of rebirth. And Jack Henry Abbott became that story, until it all came crashing down. He wasn't released because he was reformed. He was released because he wrote too well. And that gamble would come at a devastating cost. Here is the English translation of Part 3 of the Jack Henry Abbott case, adapted for A. Part 3, 6 Weeks of Freedom, and a Horrific Murder. After more than 2 decades behind bars, Jack Henry Abbott was finally free. But no one could have predicted that the price of that freedom would be someone's life. A new life, or so it seemed. Just days after his release in June 1981, Abbott became the talk of New York's literary scene. His book In the Belly of the Beast had just hit the shelves and instantly sparked a storm. Newspapers praised it, intellectuals debated it, and publishers fought to feature him. From a man once locked in solitary confinement, Jack Henry Abbott was now walking among the elite. He appeared at book signings, was interviewed on television, dined with famous writers and artists. In the eyes of many, he was living proof that the prison system could be overcome, a philosopher-prisoner who had emerged from the darkness. Abbott even declared proudly, "I didn't come out of prison to live like an ordinary man. I came out to change how people see prison. I am the proof." But what no one seemed to notice, or deliberately ignored, was one fatal truth. Jack had never learned how to live outside. Freedom was too much for a man who'd never had it. Abbott had never opened a bank account. Never gone grocery shopping. Never experienced love outside prison walls. The outside world was too fast, too loud, and far too real for the man who had imagined it from inside a cell. Every day was a battle, with anxiety, with paranoia, with the weight of expectations. He began to feel like people respected him out of fear, not understanding. And that fueled the anger that had long been simmering beneath the surface. On July 18, 1981, just 6 weeks after his release, Jack Henry Abbott entered a small cafe called Billabong in East Village, New York. The restaurant was run by a young couple, one of them being Richard Addon, a 22-year-old aspiring actor who worked as a night shift waiter. Richard knew nothing about Abbott's violent past. To him, Jack was just another late-night customer, asking to use the employee restroom. But the restroom was off-limits to customers. When Richard politely refused, Abbott snapped. The two exchanged words. Witnesses say they walked out into the alley behind the restaurant. Moments later, Abbott pulled a knife. A witness later recounted. "I heard yelling, then saw a man collapse. Blood was everywhere. The other guy just ran like nothing happened." Abbott had stabbed Richard in the chest, a fatal blow. All because of a denied bathroom request. Richard died at the scene. Jack Henry Abbott, once hailed as the voice of the voiceless, had become a murderer again. That same night, Abbott fled New York. He used fake names, hitchhiked across states, and lived like a fugitive, running not just from the law, but from the lie he had built. Meanwhile, the media exploded. Outrage filled the headlines. How could someone so dangerous have been released? Who was responsible for Richard Addon's death? Norman Mailer, the literary giant who had advocated for Abbott's release, faced a wave of backlash. Abbott's murder of Richard Addon revealed a painful truth. Sometimes, our desire to believe in change blinds us to reality. Mailer believed he was saving a soul. But in the end, he had unknowingly released a man who still wore a monster's face beneath his intellect. In just 6 weeks, Jack Henry Abbott went from symbol of hope to cold-blooded killer. And the question that shook the nation was, can the cost of believing in someone's redemption be an innocent life? Part 4, When Illusions Collapse, the Fall of a Literary Fantasy. After the death of Richard Avedon, America woke up to a harsh reality. People began asking the question no one dared ask before: how could a man who once killed, spent most of his life behind bars, and never truly integrated into society, be hailed as a literary genius? More importantly, who would be held responsible for a life lost so senselessly? News of the murder spread like wildfire. The name Jack Henry Abbott was suddenly everywhere again, but no longer as a symbol of prison reform or intellectual redemption. Now, he was known for what he truly was: a cold-blooded killer, a man who betrayed the trust of an entire society. The public wasn't just shocked. They were furious. And their anger turned to the very people who had supported Abbott's release, especially Norman Mailer. A reader once wrote in a furious letter to the editor, "I can't believe it. We released a monster from his cage just because he could string sentences together." Norman Mailer, one of America's most celebrated authors, had used his fame to advocate for Abbott's freedom. He believed Abbott's letters revealed a tortured but enlightened soul, a man worthy of a second chance. Mailer once wrote, "I believe that, placed in the right environment, a man like Abbott could make a real contribution to literature and society." But what did reality prove? Just 6 weeks after his release, Abbott had murdered someone. Mailer was harshly criticized. Many accused him of being blinded by his literary ideals, of letting his ego get in the way of judgment. The man who championed artistic freedom had helped unleash a killer. After the stabbing, Abbott vanished. He used fake names, moved from state to state, and disappeared like a ghost. But it didn't last long. On August 23, 1981, the FBI tracked him down in Louisiana and arrested him. When they found him, Abbott didn't resist. His face was eerily calm, almost emotionless. It was as if he had been expecting this ending all along. One officer later recalled, "He wasn't surprised. It was like he was waiting for us to show up." Abbott's trial began in 1982. The nation watched closely. Once again, he used his words to try and explain away the killing, calling it self-defense, blaming the stress of society, the weight of expectations. But this time, no one bought it. No author defended him. No intellectuals wrote glowing op-eds. The illusion was shattered. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the media focused on Abbott and Mailer, the true victim, Richard Avedon, was slowly forgotten. Richard was a young man full of life, an aspiring artist with dreams of success. His mother, through tears, once said, "My son wasn't some literary metaphor. He was a person. And he's dead because society made the wrong decision." Jack Henry Abbott is a chilling example of how talent does not equal rehabilitation. We allowed eloquent words to mask the core of a deeply violent man. The most haunting question remains. If Jack couldn't write so well, would anyone have ever fought to free him? Probably not. Jack was celebrated as a literary phenomenon, but in truth, he was a killer dressed up in fancy words. When the truth came crashing down, the literary world had to face a brutal reckoning. They had trusted a man who never truly changed. Part 5, the final chapter, Tragedy, Death, and the Controversial Legacy of Jack Henry Abbott. After being sentenced to life in prison, Jack Henry Abbott returned, once again, to where he truly belonged, behind bars. There were no more literary spotlights, no glowing letters, no defenders by his side. Just a lonely man, aging behind cold walls, with a name now forever linked not to brilliance, but betrayal. As the shock of the murder began to settle, America's intellectual class was forced to ask a hard question. Were we deceived by words? Jack Henry Abbott was not a symbol of rehabilitation. Not a beacon of hope. He was simply a murderer who could write well. And the most terrifying part? That very ability, his words, were what helped him walk free, only to kill again. One critic once said, "We weren't fooled by Jack. We were fooled by our own blind faith in redemption." In 2002, after over 2 decades back in prison, Jack Henry Abbott took his own life inside Wendy Correctional Facility in New York. He hanged himself using a belt. No suicide note. No goodbye. And that was the end. A life that began with abandonment, wandered through violence, touched fame, and plummeted back into darkness. The circle closed. From another angle, some argue that Jack was the twisted product of a brutal system. A child abandoned, raised in reformatories, starved of love, and taught that violence was the only language that guaranteed survival. But does that justify what he did? Can past pain excuse present murder? And more importantly, should we ever forgive someone who weaponizes words, but never learns to be human? Today, In the Belly of the Beast is still available in bookstores. Some professors still include it in prison literature classes. But now, with a bold disclaimer. This is the work of a killer, do not confuse talent with morality. Jack Henry Abbott's legacy is a bitter lesson, about society's misplaced idealism, about the dark side of compassion, and about the danger of believing what someone writes over what they actually do. If a murderer can write like a poet, would you believe he's changed? Or is it all just a performance, directed by the cold intellect of a killer? Jack Henry Abbott left behind a legacy that's as haunting as it is unforgettable. A murderer released from prison because of his writing, only to kill again just weeks later. His talent was once praised as a guiding light, but that very light led straight into tragedy. And the questions still linger, unanswered and uncomfortable. Can we truly separate art from morality? A brilliant book may come from a terrible person, but should we still read it? Is forgiveness for the past a noble act, or a fatal mistake? Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.